Napoleon 1807. This is a sequel of a game called Napoleon 1806. Makes sense, right? From the name already. It is a two-player war game about the Napoleonic era, of course. It can be played solitaire by a single player controlling both sides at the best of their possibilities, but you need to do a couple of adjustments here and there because there are cards, and when that is the case, you have to do a little more mental work to compartmentalize and make sure that one side of the brain doesn't know the cards that the other side of the brain has. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's pretty much how I see it. And I play the game solitaire, controlling both sides to the best of my possibilities. These are times of pandemic. I don't have the luxury of playing against a human opponent, and I can tell you that the game worked that way. If you already know how to play Napoleon 1806, this game is very similar. It's in essence the same game system, but with one huge difference. While Napoleon 1806 was a fixed game with a single scenario, this one comes with a stunning scenario rulebook including 13 scenarios, which also explains why the mounted board is so much larger, because you will have a campaign scenario that covers everything, and then you have smaller scenarios that only use part of the map, or scenarios that, although they make it legal to use it all, they mainly have specific areas in which most of the action will occur. Sometimes most of the action here, sometimes most of the action is here. So huge variety, huge replay value, a lot more that you can do with the components that you find in 1806 as compared to the 18... I mean, a lot more stuff you can do in 1807 as compared to the stuff that you have in 1806. The map, as you can see, is a point-to-point map, so the game pieces will be in those dots, in these squares here. It's a block war game in the sense that military units, or the position of military units, is represented by wooden blocks with stickers on them, but it's not exactly in the tradition of Columbia block war games. It doesn't have that amount of secret information. So the blocks will be on the board, and you can have multiple ones in the same location if you so desire. And that, well, again, tells you who is the commander of that group, and also tells you, possibly reminds you of other abilities and capabilities of that group, as indicated by the symbols that you see next to the illustration for the commanders. But there isn't a lot of other information there, so you wonder, okay, but how about other stuff, their strength, their size, things like that. For all of those things, you have this player aid here, and you have one for each side, and there are different ones depending on the scenario, because different people were present in different scenarios. So this one, for example, is for the Russian player, there's another one for the French player, and again, different ones, including on the other side of this player aid here, for different scenarios. The general idea remains the same, that each side has a number of commanders. Each commander has 2 lines on the player aid. Has 2 lines on the player aid. In one, you place a number of cubes indicating the number of infantry and possibly cavalry that the group has. And then under that, there is a line that is empty at the beginning of the game, and it is where you will place wooden cylinders representing fatigue. And I so wish that these were wooden cubes, so I wouldn't have to spend time chasing after these cylinders when they start rolling around the board, or at the very least I wouldn't have to worry about them rolling all over the place. I already even regret showing you the little example. So, why cylinders? I would much prefer cubes. See, now that guy's there, and I have to put my sausages in there, try to make it stand, and then I have to rearrange stuff. So much easier if it was cubes. So, fatigue. Other things also depend on the number of cubes or fatigue cylinders that you have. This is a card-driven game, and the number of cubes that you have with a certain group indicates how many cards that group will produce in combat. If you have 1 to 4 force cubes, then the card will produce 1 card in combat. You see the small one? If you have 5 to 8, then it will produce 2. That is the reminder. Fatigue will give you penalties. So actually in combat, if your fatigue is 5 or higher, you will get a penalty of minus 1. You will also lose forces if your fatigue is between 5 and 8 at the end of the turn during the recovery phase. So there are a lot of interesting things that happen here, because you may have a group that still packs a decent punch because they are large, but that punching power is reduced by the number of fatigue cylinders that they have. And so they may still be large physically, but actually they're getting fatigued and demoralized, and the group will collapse if it receives 9 fatigue cylinders. So that's the general idea here about the formation of your forces. So again, depending on the scenarios, you will set up the cubes on the map differently. And it's a card-driven game, as I mentioned, so you're gonna have 2 decks of cards, 1 for each player, with different possible events indicated on them. A number here that is used in a variety of ways, such as resolving combat and determining movement. Really, this is pretty much one of the most important things in the game. Here you have a box to indicate the damage that that card inflicts in combat, and here you have another number of symbols, which is for recovery purposes. As you can see, by playing that card, for example, I get to remove 2 fatigue cylinders. How does the turn work? Each turn you start by drawing 3 cards from your deck and adding them to the cards that you have from the previous rounds. Then players will need to commit a card to determine initiative, and then the main gameplay starts when the players can alternate performing actions. As your action, you can choose to perform operations, and when you do so, you will activate a stack of commanders that still needs to be activated. After performing an operation, a stack will be flipped face down, or I should say the marker for that. The marker for a unit will be turned face down to indicate that it is activated. Before that is the case, they are to be activated. So you choose a location and you can form a stack with units in that location that still have to be activated. With those units, you can do 3 things, or 1 or 3 things. You can move or attack or perform a moving attack. You can attack without moving only if you start the activation already in a location with an enemy, because maybe the previous turn there was a battle there which was inconclusive, no winners, no losers, no one retreats. In this case, the action can be to attack directly. Otherwise, you can move, and that's just it, moving from connection to connection, or performing a moving attack, which is when you move and you also enter a location that contains an enemy. When you decide to move, you're gonna draw a card, you're gonna reveal a card, and you're gonna look at the number in the top right corner that indicates how many locations you get to move. That's basically movement points. That is reduced by 1 for each unit after the first that you're moving. So for example, if I reveal this card to move this block here by itself, I can move it by 2 locations, 1, 2. But if I reveal it as I'm moving these 2, then the first block after the first, in this case 1, gives you a penalty of -1, so actually I can only move these 2 as a group by 1 location. Again, I have to stop in any case if I enter an area that has an enemy in it. I also gain fatigue from moving. I gain 1 point of fatigue for each location after the third, or for each movement point after the third that I spend. So 4 movement points, 1 fatigue, 5 movement points that I use. There you go, the cylinder is 2 fatigues, and so on and so forth. Other effects may modify that. For example, entering a contested area will add fatigue to my stack. So I'm already there, fatigue, before I even start doing anything. As for combats, combat is incredibly simple, incredibly intuitive, and yet it really feels right. It's pretty impressive. So, when there is combat, I will look at all of the forces involved, and basically it's a matter of determining how many cards will be drawn by each side. The number, as you saw earlier, it showed you on the player aid, that number is based on the size of the forces. So for example, we're going to see how many cards this unit produces and how many cards this unit produces. We modify that based on factors such as the presence of commanders. We look at how many cards this unit produces, modify that again based on all situations and conditions that apply. And at that point, when all is said and done, simply there will be a number of cards that are drawn from each side. And this time we'll look at the top left corner. And so simply we just resolved that the Russians have inflicted 3 fatigue cylinders on the opponent and 1 actual loss. And suppose that the French, meanwhile, have produced these cards, and that gives the opponent 3 fatigues and 2 losses. If a side inflicts more losses to the opponent than it receives, then that side is the winner and the opponent has to retreat, otherwise the battle, you take the losses, or maybe both sides are just fatigued, and the battle is inconclusive, and so there is no movement there. Again, you have at the end of the turn, you're going to have recovery. If a unit, because remember, after a unit activates or fights, then the unit is spent, counts as activated. At the end of the turn, units that are still on their to be activated side will recover all their fatigue, which is awesome, but that usually means that those units are really far from the action. Sometimes you want to engage the opponent precisely to keep out the pressure, to prevent them from recovering from fatigue. So that's a way of recovering from fatigue. You can also play cards to reduce fatigue by the number indicated in the bottom right corner of a card. Again, during the recovery phase, units that have between 5 and 8 fatigue will experience a loss of a strength cube. And I would say that's the general idea. So as you can see, it's very, very simple, very intuitive. Activate stacks of units, revealing cards to determine how much they move. You engage, you resolve battles in one of the most intuitive ways ever, really. And that's about it. And then you keep playing turn after turn until a player wins based on the conditions of the scenario. And the victory conditions change from scenario to scenario, but usually taking control of specific locations on the map or inflicting damage on the opponent are good ways to ensure that you're going to win the game. The game system remains vastly unchanged from the previous installment, from Napoleon 1806, but at the core, it remains a very simple, very approachable game. There are a couple of more things that I explained in the main segment. There are sieges, there are other things that you can do, optional rules, but I wanted to give you a sense of how really approachable, how digestible the game system is in case you have just started playing war games or you're planning to introduce somebody new to the hobby, or I should say to this side of the hobby, to the wargaming side of the hobby. If you're in doubt between 1806 and 1807, definitely go for 1807 because you get a lot more value for the money. In 1806 you have a great system, but of course a lot more limited gameplay with basically one main scenario, as opposed to here you have a lot of stuff. Now, some scenarios do link the two games together, so you will need 1806 to play them together. But in general, you get a lot more replay value, and just different situations, different challenges from 1807. And maybe not every scenario is super exciting. Some are about the pain and misery of getting stuck in the mud, so maybe there's not going to be a riveting situation, but there can be merit in exploring, in fact, the pain and frustration of trying to go anywhere, but you have all of these events and all those limitations that get you stuck in the mud. In most scenarios, however, you do have a nice balance between, yes, the problem, the logistics problems, the problems of transportation in this specific time and place, but also at the same time you have maneuver, which really is one of the key elements of the game. Maneuvering those units around, try to march to the sound of the guns to get there and reinforce a situation, try to move away from it and try to bait and switch the opponent so that that core that is almost about to collapse is put in the back, is put in the rear of the action so you can regenerate and somebody else gets in the front, but then something else happens and that doesn't really work, etc, etc, etc. You have very interesting situations that emerge from the map, from the scenarios, and from the different organization of the circumstances and the different way in which pieces maneuver on the board, which again gives you just the right balance there, I believe, between limitations and yet places that you can do. So to me, a good game gives you both limits, obstacles to overcome, but also a range of things that you can do. Otherwise it's not a game really, and this game really does that. It has that quality of presenting me with dilemmas and presenting me therefore with interesting decisions. The production values are very high. If you know the previous game, you find the same things here, all the good stuff. Unfortunately, also those pesky little red cylinders. I don't know what happened there, why anybody would think that's a better idea than, say, smaller cubes. But so be it, that is what we get. Other than that, the production values are very high. The map looks just beautiful. Those pieces, the wooden pieces, always pleasant to me to play with wooden pieces, with the blocks and the cubes, not with the cylinders. The cards are very high quality, so production value is really, really good. The rule book is well laid out. If you haven't played the previous game, it's not going to be a problem to learn this one. And so that's another great advantage, that you have a game here that definitely is not hard to learn and to absorb, but at the same time it presents you with a lot of interesting elements that will keep you interested even if you are a seasoned war gamer, or a new war gamer, or a seasoned war gamer, or somebody like me, a seasoned war gamer that is often mentally exhausted these days of a pandemic and homeschooling my kids due to the pandemics and everything happened at the same time. And then at the end of the day, when I want to play a war game, it has to be more linear or easier to pick up than games that maybe I played 2-3 years ago. So perfect. Whatever your relation with wargaming is, whatever the level of energy that you have left, Napoleon 1807 is a game that will probably be entertaining to you. And it's just a system that moves so smoothly with, yes, a random element because of the cards, but also precisely because of that, more interesting decisions, more problems that you have to solve. I really like how smooth and simple the combat system is, and yet it still makes sense. A core is large, hooray! Produces a lot of contributes a lot to the combat. However, it's also fatigue, so not as much. The other things, the commander, etc, etc, etc. Such a simple system, and yet the results just feel right. And you have again a combination of fatigue and actual losses that again adds to the pile of interesting elements that you will have to figure out and to handle. So I'm really happy. I'm really impressed. I like the previous game, and this other game here, 1807. I find all the things that I liked in this game, plus the cylinders. I find all the things that I liked in the previous game with a lot more to do, with incredibly more varied and sandboxy approach, and to me that is just absolutely great. So Napoleon 1807, definitely a very solid game with definitely a large range of things that you can do, and so more value for your money.